Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I know many people here are watching WrestlePalooza right now on ESPN. Plus the uh, the inaugural event of WWE on ESPN slash Disney Plus slash Hulu. This conglomerate of Disney and the WWE, this marriage of Disney and the WWE has finally come to fruition, and they have finally consummated the marriage. They finally come together. They flirted for a while, and they finally come together. And this is the inaugural event. This is the event they are showing, which is to be headlined by AJ Lee and CM Punk versus Seth Rollins and Becky Lynch. But there are many people who are not watching the event, and these people are people in the wrestling community, in the IWC, that are boycotting the event because of Jimmy Kimmel's firing this week. People with a political stance, people that feel like ABC and Disney were wrong for their firing of Jimmy Kimmel. It's a breach of free speech. Now, as Lisa has stated, it is bigger than Jimmy Kimmel, obviously, because the head of the FCC, which is the government agency that oversees broadcasting, was pressured. So was came from the higher ups. It came from the federal government. But the fact is, ABC, Disney, that whole family of properties caved. They caved. Now this is nothing new for them. They've done this before. But the difference with this is this is being done to the left now. This is being done to the left. They've done this before with Gina Carano. Gina Carano was fired. Hey, Lisa, what's going on? Gina Carano was fired by ABC back a couple of years ago for comments she made. Roseanne was fired by ABC for the racist comments that she made. But the difference here was that the FCC did not play a role in the firing of Gina Carano from The Mandalorian or the firing of Roseanne from her TV show. That was completely done by the corporation itself, by Walt Disney. The Walt Disney Corporation, on behalf of their network, ABC. You know what I mean? So there was nothing to protest there. But people did protest. People did at that time protest on behalf of Gina Carano and on behalf of Roseanne. You know what I mean? But now the tables have turned. Now it's the Democratic side that is complaining. But here's another big difference. Gina Carano did say what she said. She did compare the so-called witch hunt of right-wingers to the Holocaust. And Roseanne did say about the Obama staffer, Valerie Jarrett, comparing her to the child of the Planet of the Apes and the Muslim Brotherhood. She said those things. You know what I'm saying? Jimmy Kimmel did not say a joke about Charlie Kirk's death. You know what I mean? He did not joke about Charlie Kirk's death. He did not. The joke was that MAGA. Yes, Lisa's correct. And why are they complaining? Lisa's saying that it's not just Democrats complaining, it's Republicans too. Ted Cruz is one of those who's complaining. And I'll tell you why that is. Because again, the FCC stepped in. It's not just the company. That's the difference. When it was Gina Carano and when it was Roseanne, it was just ABC. It was just Disney, right? ABC is owned by Disney. It has been since 1997. You know what I mean? And ESPN is too. And like we said, now WWE is partners with ESPN. They've joined the family too. They're not owned by them. You know what I mean? They don't make decisions for them, but they'll be broadcasting their pay-per-views from today onward. But there's trouble in WWE as well with regards to this Charlie Kirk situation. As many people know, The Rock's daughter came out and she tweeted Ava Rain. She is on the on-screen general manager of NXT, which is WWE's developmental brand. She came out and she tweeted, if you want to be remembered for good things, do good things. Or say, if you want to be remembered for your words and actions and good deeds and things, do and say good deeds and things. And people criticized her for it. And she was not let go. She was not fired by the company, by TKO, because she's The Rock's daughter. Like, The Rock is on the board of directors. They're not going to fire his own child for something she said. But this is a freedom of speech issue. And like Lisa's saying, it's not just Democrats, it's Republicans, because the government stepped in, FCC stepped in, right? And that is a breach of the First Amendment. That is a total breach of the First Amendment. So it's not the same thing. I hear a lot of people that are defenders of ABC and ABC and Disney defending them, saying, well, they did it to Roseanne, they did it to Gina Carano on The Mandalorian, right? It's the same thing. It's not the same thing because they got a government agency involved, and it wasn't just the company. Trump used his power, the power of the federal government, to stifle somebody, to stifle criticism. Now, it was stupid, in my opinion, because Jimmy Kimmel was wrong. You know what I mean? The shooter was not a MAGA Republican. You know what I mean? The alleged shooter was not a MAGA Republican. He was indeed, he leaned to the left politically. Right, Lisa's correct. Difference is Trump got involved. He was not a MAGA Republican, so the joke didn't even make sense. But even if the joke were about Charlie Kirk, which it was not about Charlie Kirk, he was not laughing at the fact that Charlie Kirk got shot. There were people online that said worse things about Charlie Kirk, passing away. And they didn't, and some of them did lose their jobs. And listen, anybody that gets fired for making a joke and saying something is going against what they claim that Charlie Kirk died for. The claim is that Charlie Kirk died to protect freedom of speech, right? That he was a free speech martyr, that he was going to college campuses and he was expressing himself in a free speech sort of way, and he was silenced because he spoke out. If you then, as the Attorney General Pam Bondi said, now we have the Republicans talking about they're going to pass hate speech laws. Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, is saying that they're going to pass hate speech laws. If you're going to pass a law in Charlie Kirk's name that is against free speech, you are dishonoring the memory of Charles James Kirk. You know what I'm saying? Then he died for nothing. You know what I'm saying? That's like passing a law in Martin Luther King's name that reinstates racism. You know what I mean? You claim this man died for a cause, yet in his own name and because his passing, you're going to silence people and you're going to shut down free speech. That's against everything that Charlie Kirk stood for. That was his mission. His mission was to engage people politically and argue with those he disagreed with. You know what I'm saying? So if you're going to stifle that argument and you're going to shut down that kind of communication, then you are dishonoring his memory. What you claim, what the right side of the political spectrum claims that he died for. Other people that were not his, that were not his supporters and not his fans and not fans of Republicans and not fans of right-wing ideology will say that he stood for other things. You know what I mean? But The mainstream argument is that, and it will go down in history, mark my words, it will go down in history that on September 10th, 2025, Charles James Kirk died and was assassinated for free speech. That will be the reason, that will be the official reason that they give for the reason he was assassinated. So if that's the reason and that causes the government to crack down on free speech, that sucks. And that's against his memory, and that's against everything he stood for. Yeah, Lisa saying Trump didn't get mad at the first part of the joke. He got mad at the second part. Jimmy Kimmel brings up the lack of grieving Trump is doing, changing the conversation. Exactly. We spoke about this last night on the live stream, that for a person who claimed that they loved Charlie Kirk, a person who was the best friend of Charlie Kirk, supposedly, somebody who did a lot to help um, Trump get elected both times, but especially in 2024, especially his second term, was Charlie Kirk. This guy was the architect basically of Trump's second run. He was like Steve Bannon was the architect of the first run, but Charlie Kirk and others, younger people were the ones responsible for his second his second run. This is why um, Trump was going on all these podcasts. Part of the reason, Barron also, but really, Charlie Kirk, he was going on all these podcasts. He was going on Joe Rogan. He was going on all this, and he was doing all this, and this helped him win. For somebody that supposedly meant so much to the conservative movement in 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 the in the in in the 2020s, you know, as soon as you hear he's passing away, you shift the conversation to the redecorating of your ballroom. You know what I mean? It it, it just it just shows that Trump is self-centered. You know what I mean? He's self-centered. He thinks the world revolves around him. He doesn't really care about anybody. I'm surprised he didn't bring up, after Charlie Kirk's assassination, oh, I got shot too. You know what I mean? He thinks if it doesn't involve him, it's not important. You know what I mean? So uh, he's going to pretend like he's grieving with you. But I think the implication, though, yes, Lisa's correct. In fact, she sent me information that the stock for Disney, and this doesn't really affect WWE necessarily because, again, like I said, they're separate companies. Their stock is separate, but Disney stock is going down tremendously. It is at a 0.96 in drop currently. And this is bad PR for Bob Iger because Bob Iger, Disney is already struggling. You know what I mean? This company has been mismanaged for the longest now. You know, you know what I mean? Um, this president, not Donald Trump, of Disney, of the president of Disney, Bob Iger, he's terrible at captaining this ship. You know what I mean? They have canceled. I mean, they have all their live action films have flopped. They've attempted to appeal to too much wokeness, with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and stuff, and a lot of bad publicity. So on top of this, You know, this is dumping on them. You know what I mean? They had a tremendous comeback in the 2010s. Everybody hailed Bob Iger as a genius. That he was growing Disney's empire so much. You know, acquiring Marvel in 2008, acquiring Star Wars in 2012, acquiring um, 20th Century Fox and Family Guy and The Simpsons in 2019. It's like, okay, can this guy do anything wrong? And then he steps down, and Bob Chapek takes over for a while, and then he's brought back, and it continues to go to shit. Like this decade, the 2020s uh, have not been kind to them. Lisa says she read that the other CEO of Disney was shocked that they got involved in politics this way. Um, you know, I think you're referring to Bob Chapek or maybe Michael Eisner. I'm not sure which guy. But during the Michael Eisner years, Disney never got involved in politics. That was forbidden. You know what I mean? The, this was like the 80s and the 90s. They never got involved in politics ever. That was just forbidden. They didn't even use really political messaging in their movies during that time. You know, and of course, during the early days of Disney, they did get involved in politics. When Walt Disney himself was alive and running things, they were involved in politics, but they were involved in conservative politics. Walt Disney, the man, was a very staunch Republican. He was a very staunch Republican. Um, Hardline Republican, to the point that during the 1950s, during uh, the trial against un-American activities by Wisconsin's. I know, David. Uh, During the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which was organized by Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy, for many people that don't know and haven't studied this part of American history, Joseph McCarthy was a Republican senator from Wisconsin who believed that all American institutions were um, infested with communism. The Army, the Navy, and most of all, the film industry. So what he did was he targeted suspected communists in the film industry. And Walt Disney was one of those who was working with him to uncover the communists within the American film industry. And Ronald Reagan was the other guy. Two guys, Ronald Reagan and Walt Disney in Hollywood at that time, were working to weed out these suspected communists. Now, many of them weren't members of the Communist Party, but they but they were just liberals, you know what I mean? They were just laborists. In the case of the people that worked at Walt Disney's animation studio, they wanted a union. They wanted to be unionized. They wanted workers' rights. And during the making of Dumbo, they actually went on strike. So when Disney testified against these people working in his studio, it was like, are you serious? Are you seriously calling this little group of animators communists because they want to organize a union against you so that you don't pay them shit money and work them like a slave master? Is this what you really are calling communist? You know what I mean? Like, American subversives. It was insane. You know what I mean? But that was Walt Disney's politics. He was very, very conservative, and he was very, very dark side of Disney. He was very anti-Semitic. He uh, he was one of the only non-Jewish persons that was owning a studio in Hollywood at the time, and he believed that um, Jewish Jewish people and communism were synonymous with each other, and he was very paranoid that they were taking over Hollywood. Jack Warner, his famous adversary of Warner Brothers, and when the writers and the animators of Dumbo went on strike, Jack Warner was out there with a picket sign protesting, in the strike. But he was Jewish. Of course, all the other Hollywood executives were all Jewish. Walt Disney was the only one who really wasn't out of them all. You know what I mean? So that made him very paranoid. But hey, what do you expect from a guy from the Midwest? And there's another story with regards to African Americans about Walt Disney that Bob Melendez, who was one of the original animators in Walt Disney, tells that Walt saw a person, an animator, a new guy that they had hired was a dark-skinned Indian, right, from India, but he thought this was a black guy. And he got so upset that a black guy was supposedly working for his company that he blew a gasket. He smoked more than usual, and Disney was a serial smoker. You know what I mean? And he immediately had the guy fired. Now the guy wasn't even black, you know what I mean? But he was dark skinned enough to pass for a black guy. So that's some of the things about Walt Disney that was, iffy. About his legacy. The company really doesn't talk much about his legacy because of those things, because of the anti-Semitism, because of the racism that is a part of his legacy. Notice there's never been a movie. I mean, this man was supposedly a giant in the world of American entertainment, and there's never been a movie about his life ever produced by his movie studio. Oh wow, Lisa's saying she heard that Disney Plus is trying to prevent the customers from canceling their subscriptions by offering lower deals and just not having the cancel button. Yeah, I mean, well, that's not going to help. I mean, they have so many properties right now, sports, movies, Star Wars, but like that, none of it is any good. So if your politics are inclined to cancel it for that reason, then you're not going to really miss anything. Their alliance with WWE is crazy because fans of WWE don't like this because we liked Peacock. We were comfortable with Peacock. We were comfortable. WWE had the deal with Peacock since 2021. WWE and NBC had a relationship going back to the 80s, and that relationship should have been respected. But since Vince McMahon and say what you want about Vince, he is the. It's funny that we're talking about Disney and WWE at the same time, but Vince McMahon is the Walt Disney of the latter half of the 20th century. There, in my mind, in the world of entertainment anyway, not Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, of course, those guys, and then Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg. But in the world of entertainment, in the 20th century, there were two giants in the world of entertainment. One for the first half of the 20th century, which was Walt Disney, and the other, in the second half of the 20th century, Vince McMahon. But and both have their legacies of sexism, racism, misogyny, and Vince doesn't have a history of anti-Semitism, really. Jews don't really Jewish people don't really work in wrestling. I mean that's not really a thing. You know what I mean? So like he didn't have to battle that, but also very conservative. Both guys very conservative, very against unions. Vince McMahon too was against unions, flat, full stop, flat out, no unions. We know the story of WrestleMania 2, where Jesse Ventura tried to organize a union, much like the animators in the Dumbo movie, during Dumbo. And, Hulk Hogan ratted him out, and Jesse was fired after that. So both guys, no unions, both guys, a history of racism, uh, pro-conservative, pro-Republican, both guys, you know, very similar. But one thing you could say about Vince was that he kept the prices economical for fans. $9.99 a month for the WWE Network when it was independent on its own from 2014 to 2021, and then when he partnered with Peacock again from 2021 to now, it was kept low. But he sold the company to TKO and to the owners of the UFC, and they merged it. And now they're raising the prices to astronomical levels to be able to watch it with this ESPN partnership. And many fans were already upset about that. So you pile that on, much like Disney, you pile that on with yeah, Lisa, they're on ESPN right now. And ESPN is owned by Disney, so technically, yeah, they've become part of the Disney family tonight. Tonight is their wedding night. Tonight is the night uh, when it becomes official between the two companies. They are now on ESPN and they are now part of that conglomerate. And the only way you can see it is one of the ways you can see it. The only way you can see it is by purchasing the ESPN Unlimited app, which is part of the Disney bundle that includes Hulu and Disney Plus. Yeah, both companies are receiving flack from their separate fan bases because of their greed. Well, Disney because of their politics, but WWE because of their greed and their politics. Because in the summer they brought back Brock Lesnar, and Brock Lesnar was named in the Janelle Grant lawsuit, which is a sexual assault lawsuit. So I mean, we can't have nice things. We just can't have nice things in the world because. And for me, it would make sense for me to love this marriage. It would make sense for me if I wasn't taking a political stand to love this coming together, because I love Disney. I love Disney's properties. I love Star Wars. I love the Disney classic animation movies from the 90s when Lisa and I were kids, The Lion King, Aladdin, all the Disney classic movies. I love those. And I love the WWE. So it makes sense for this marriage to be a marriage that I would rejoice in, that I would love. But if these companies weren't as criminal as they both are and willing to sell out American values for the almighty dollar, maybe that's what America is, capitalism. You, you know, and, But I would love this. This would be something that I'm like, I'm getting everything with this Disney bundle. I'm getting everything I love together in one place: Star Wars content, Disney classic content, and WWE content all together. That would make sense for me to be all over that, but I didn't. I couldn't. I just couldn't. I can't ever take a stand against free speech. I'm an absolutist when it comes to free speech. I believe that is what makes America different than any other country in this world, is that we're allowed to speak our minds. We cannot lose that. Lisa and I have argued. Lisa said the View didn't say anything, which she's kind of shocked. I'm not, because they're on ABC. We cannot lose that ever, guys. Lisa and I have argued this too. I'm a free speech absolutist. I believe people should be allowed to say whatever they want to say, as long as they're not inciting violence against somebody. You know what I mean? You can't threaten violence. That goes against free speech. But as far as political views, opinions, I'm all for it. I don't believe in hate speech laws. I think that's bullshit. you, you, you know what I mean? I think hate speech laws are bullshit. You know, because that's a slippery slope. Once you start saying something is hate speech, who's to determine what hate speech is? You know what I mean? If you're not inciting violence, anybody could be considered hate speech. I could say Trump is a fat piece of shit, and then that is considered hate speech. No, you do agree on that, Lisa. But one time on the when Trump was banned from Twitter, I remember the argument that we had, and you came and said that it's not a violation of free speech. I said it is. On, on that, and I don't like Trump, but I don't agree that he should have been banned from Twitter. You know what I mean? Back when Jack Dorsey owned it, before Elon Musk owned it. You know what I mean? Like, this was after the riots, after the J6 riots. We cannot lose that. You know what I mean? I don't care. I go by this motto. This is what I go by. I say I may not like what you have to say, but I'll defend like hell your right to say it. And that includes despicable people that I can't stand, that I consider to be deplorable. Now, on my own channel, I reserve that right to ban you if you make racist remarks, bigoted remarks, homophobic remarks. I reserve that right. And private companies like Twitter, like ABC, they reserve that right. But the difference here, again, the FCC stepped in, the government stepped in. That cannot be done. The government, no. The government should not ever ban free speech. But Trump is not for free speech, right? He talks about the Alien and Sedition Act. What is the Alien and Sedition Act? What is that? That is a law passed in the 1790s under the administration of the second president of the United States, John Adams, in which John Adams, now keep in mind, he's only the second president of the United States. The country is still new. But during this time, John Adams had people jailed because he was going to war with France. He was engaging in a semi-military conflict with France at this time. And he and a lot of people disagreed with it because France helped us win the American Revolution. France was our best friend. France has been our oldest friend in Western Europe forever, right? So a lot of people disagreed with him going to war with France at this time. And what was he doing? He was having people locked up that were disagreeing with him going to war with France. This is the Alien and Sedition Act in the 1790s. And Trump has talked about this act. You know what I mean? And this is very un-American. This is not the American way. Like I said, you look at every form of government in the world ever in history: monarchies, totalitarian communists, fascists, um, theocrats like Iran and Saudi Arabia, right? You look at these countries, the difference with these countries and us is that we have the First Amendment. That is we lose that, we lose the country. We lose that, the Constitution is toilet paper. You know, it's worthless because everything else, all the other amendments, right? All the other 27 or 26, what have you, amendments to the Constitution of the United States mean nothing if you lose the first one. That is what the founders fought for. That is the essence of freedom, to be able to live free. If we lose freedom, we lose it all. You know, and that includes freedom of the press, that includes freedom of speech, that includes freedom of religion, that includes freedom of assembly. These are our God-given rights, according to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Endowed by the Creator, by God. These are God-given rights. These are not to be given and taken away by governments of men. And that's what the founders understood, and that's why they rebelled against England, because they understood that freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of the press and everything that the British crown at the time, King George III, was doing against them was a violation of not just rights of a government to man, but a violation of the rights of men that were given to men by God Himself. You know what I mean? So Trump is not the Lord. Trump is not God. Trump cannot take away rights. He cannot give rights. He is a mortal man like we are. And every president and every ruler on head of state is a mortal man like we are. If we don't recognize that, then we lose what makes us unique. We're no different than China. We're no different than Russia. We're no different than Nazi Germany. We're no different than fascist Italy. That's the difference, guys. And in several key times in our history, this has been never breached, but has been flirted with being breached. We talked about the communist witch hunts, the anti-communist witch hunts of Joseph McCarthy. That was one of the times when Americans' private lives were investigated and their freedoms were infringed upon. The Alien Sedition Act, and that was in the 1950s. The Alien and Sedition Act of John Adams, that was another time. Slavery, obviously, was a big one. And, and in our own lifetime, in Lisa and I's own generation, we saw the Patriot Act, which was enacted by George W. Bush following the events of September 11th. That was highly invasive. That was checking people's phone records, checking people's library cards, checking people's personal information. In the name of national security, I implore you what Benjamin Franklin said after the first Continental Congress. He said, they were deliberating there in Philadelphia, and they came out, and this woman said to him, well, what is it? You know what I mean? Like, what type of government are the new American people going to have? And he said, a republic, ma'am, if you can keep it. In other words, this is a republic. This is a constitutional republic based on the rule of law. But that can be broken. It was broken in history before. I point you to ancient Rome. We talked before about Julius Caesar and how he represented a major change in Roman society. Rome was a republic like we were, based on the rule of law, the 12 tables of Roman law. And because of infighting and because of civil wars between two factions in the Roman government, the plebeians and the patricians, Um, it caused a lot of uncertainty, and they turned to Julius Caesar to solve it. And what happened to Julius Caesar on March the 15th in 44 BC? He was assassinated. He was stabbed to death on the Senate floor because they believed he was getting to be too powerful and he was going to be a tyrant. Come to find out, hey, because of his death, the Roman Republic, which was a free republic of free men, becomes the Roman Empire, with Julius Caesar's nephew Octavian taking power and becoming the first Caesar, Caesar Augustus. So the founding fathers, they studied antiquity, they studied history, they knew that it happened before in history, and they didn't want it to happen again. Because as Ben Franklin also said, any people that will trade security for freedom are people fit to have neither. If you will trade if you will trade your freedom for security, you are fit to have neither freedom nor security. Because people will say, oh, well, I feel safe, when the government has more power. I feel safer that way. You know what I mean? I feel safe with acts like the Patriot Act or Joseph McCarthy's, communist witch hunts or the Alien and Sedition Act or what Trump is doing. You know what I mean? It's the right thing to do. It's a moral crusade. Well, that's what they believed in the Roman Empire too, right? They believed that Julius Caesar and Julius Caesar's line, the Julio Claudian empires, the early ones, could provide them with security, could solve their problems, could solve the social unrest between the patricians and the plebeians. So they traded their freedom for security. Is that what you want? You know what I mean? Because that's what these agents of chaos want. These agents of chaos, these accelerators, these people, they want to cause so much social unrest in our society, right? That it causes us to say, you know what we need? We need a totalitarian government. We need a fascist government. We need a dictatorship. We need to do away with the Constitution and create a new Constitution. Is that what you want? You want Donald Trump to be the next Julius Caesar? Do you want Donald Trump to take over the American government, to throw away the American experiment? To throw away democratic republicanism, to throw away the rule of law, to override the rule of law? Because people that say it can't happen, people that say it's not ironclear, yes, the Constitution works as a bulwark against that, but anything can change. It's happened before in our history. It's never happened completely in our history, but it's happened before in our history. We've had presidents like Woodrow Wilson, for example, that believed that the Constitution was outdated and that it needed to be changed and modified to an unrecognizable degree. So that's what you want. That's what you're going to get. But it never works out. Guys, time and time again in human history, civilizations and people have turned to totalitarian governments. They've turned to communism. They've turned to fascism. It happened in Germany. Germany was one of the nations that was the most progressive and the most liberal. And, the most enlightened, you would think. And then in 1933, they elected, not that they took power, but they elected. It wasn't like Russia, where in Russia, the Bolsheviks took power after the Civil War in 1917. But in Germany, they elected a dictator. They elected Adolf Hitler to be that dictator. Because they felt safe. They felt secure. They felt that the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, was providing them with security, providing them with safety, because they were scared of communism. They were scared of Jewish influence in the Weimar Republic, which was the previous government. So Italy and fascism, it was similar with Benito Mussolini. In Russia, In Russia, during World War One, they felt the Tsarist government was ineffective, so they overthrew it and they traded in their freedoms that they were starting to have, very limited freedoms, because again, Slavic civilization, Russian civilization is much different, than Western European civilization. But it's happened everywhere. It happened in the French Revolution. Much like us, the French went through a revolution in 1789, and unlike us, it didn't result in a free republic. It resulted in the dictatorship, which eventually led to Maximilian Robespierre, and then Robespierre was overthrown and eventually led to Napoleon Bonaparte. You know what I mean? So, time and time again in history, we've seen dictators rise and fall. But what do they all have in common? They all prey upon the insecurities of a weak public in uncertain times. In Star Wars, one of Disney's properties, bringing it back to Disney, in Star Wars, we saw this happen. You know what I mean? In Palpatine, who was a senator in the Galactic Republic from Naboo, he caused a war between the separatists and the Republic, and he manipulated in order to gain power, to gain political power and gain political prominence. And then he staged a fake assassination in which the Jedi supposedly tried to kill him. And then he went into the Senate floor and he gave a speech. Look at my disfigured body. I stand before you as a conquered and injured man. And then the next words out of his mouth were, the Galactic Republic will now become the Galactic Empire. Who does that sound like? Trump, after he got a fake assassinated, almost, right? I stand before you, a weakened and battered man. Do I believe there is a difference between MAGA and regular Republicans? To some degree, Lisa, but the only difference really is the worshipfulness of Trump. Ironically enough, and I'm in the process of reading it, or rather listening to it right now, Charlie Kirk was the author of something called the MAGA Doctrine. And I'm in the process of listening to that right now, in which he spells out the differences between what you're talking about, regular Republicanism versus MAGAism. There is some slight differences, but ultimately, no. I mean, I think that the MAGA doctrine is the worshipfulness of Trump, and the puts the cult of personality of Donald Trump at the forefront of the MAGA movement. Because here's what happened with the Republican Party, a little bit of history. Republicans were founded in Wisconsin in the 1850s as a party solely dedicated to ending slavery. That was their primary objective. End slavery. The abolition of slavery. Because the previous party that was the opposition to the Democrats was the Whig Party, and their Whigs were split. There were Whigs in the North that were anti-slavery, and there were Whigs in the South called Cotton Whigs that were pro-slavery, but the Republicans were all anti-slavery. That was their objective, right? And they nominate their first president, Abraham Lincoln, in 1860. Abraham Lincoln wins the nomination for the party and ultimately the presidency. And the South, which was all Democrat at that time. There were almost no Republicans in the South. They understood that this meant that the Republicans were going to get their objectives accomplished, which was to end slavery. So they seceded from the Union. Then you have the Civil War, right? And after the Civil War, the Reconstruction begins, federal troops occupying the South. But it was Rutherford B. Hayes in the 1870s who reached a corrupt bargain. And in order to gain Democratic, he was from New York, but in order to gain Democratic support for his election, this was 1870s, late 1860s, early 1870s, he decided to create a bargain with the Democrats of the South to end Reconstruction. And then, Republicans, they wave the bloody shirt and they become the dominant party. But eventually they move to the right economically, and Democrats move to the left economically. But to answer your question, though, Lise, without getting into the party switch and the Southern strategy that was used by Richard Nixon to gain the sympathies of white segregationists, no, ultimately they are the same Republican Party that they've been since the beginning of the 20th century. The last time they changed their philosophy was after Theodore Roosevelt left the party in 1912 to form the Progressive Party / Bull Moose Party. So no, I don't believe that they're a different party. George Bush Jr. said, well, George Bush Jr., here's the thing. The Bushes were never liked by hardcore Republicans. There's something called the conservative movement conservatives, which were basically the modern day split or the modern day iteration between Democrats and Republicans occurs when FDR passes New Deal legislation. FDR is elected to office in 1932. And he starts to enact New Deal legislation, which is basically it expands the power of the federal government. And the people that were against him, those that were against him, were New Deal anti-New Dealers. Like they were against Social Security, they were against all these government programs that FDR was trying to put into place to get us out of the Great Depression. So those were movement conservatives. And for the longest time, those movement conservatives, because Truman was a Democrat, Eisenhower was a Republican, but both parties wanted Eisenhower to run. He was like a moderate. He was in between. He was a moderate Republican. He wasn't a movement conservative. So these movement conservatives, they were underground for so many years, right? But due to the upheaval of the civil rights movement, they started to gain more steam and more traction, right? And in 1964, Barry Goldwater runs for president. And he is a movement conservative. He is one of these hardcore conservatives. And he loses tremendously to Lyndon Johnson, who has the country's support because he was JFK's vice president. But he plants the seed of this conservative movement. And then years later, Ronald Reagan becomes the conservative champion, the champion of movement conservatism when he becomes president in 1980. Now, to go to the Bushes, George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, ran against Ronald Reagan initially in the Republican primaries. And a lot of it boils down to regionalism. Even though the Bushes say they're from Texas and George Bush Jr. is from Texas, in actuality, the bloodline of the Bushes goes back to Connecticut, a liberal state. So they were kind of liberal Republicans. They weren't really hardcore Republicans, not economically, because during their primary debate between H.W. and Reagan, it was George H.W. Bush who coined the phrase voodoo economics. He lampooned Reagan's idea of supply side economics. He said that supply side economics was voodoo economics. It was basically magic. It didn't work. It didn't make sense, right? And it didn't. You know, the idea that you're going to cut taxes on the rich and expect that that wealth from the rich is going to trickle down to the poor is not going to work, because what's going to happen is the rich, or they're going to just take all the wealth for themselves and not give anything to the poor. And then you're going to have a permanent underclass, which is what happened, right, under Ronald Reagan. That's why Ronald Reagan was such a disaster economically for many people. And Bush Jr. or Sr. did not believe in this. So much so, Lisa, that a hardcore conservative, Pat Buchanan, ran against H.W. Bush in 1992 as a harder core conservative than H.W. And as far as the son, although it seems like the son was closer in philosophy to hardcore conservatives and hardcore Republicans, because he was an evangelical. So he appealed a lot to their base, right? Because he was an evangelical, and because he said that and during the debates with Al Gore, he said his favorite philosopher was Jesus, right? He appealed a lot more to the religious side, but he didn't appeal a lot more to the spending side. He actually spent more than Bill Clinton. He grew the size of government twice as much as Bill Clinton, his predecessor. And with H.W., with the father, one of the things that cost him the election in 1992 was he said the words, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and he raised taxes. So he went against the Republican ethos of less taxes and smaller government. You know what I mean? So, no, they weren't really liked. And they supported him in the war in Iraq. That's true. But after it came out that he lied about weapons of mass destruction, he became persona non grata in the Republican Party, which is one of the reasons I always say why Barack Obama won the election in 2008 was because conservatives were tired, Republicans were tired of these half, he coined the phrase compassionate conservatism, which is basically the idea that, conservatives or Republicans could be like Democrats light, and they could use the power of the federal government to help people, around the world with his donations of HIV in Africa and things of that nature. But no, they weren't really liked, and they weren't really liked by the MAGA base, because the MAGA comes about, the birth of MAGA happens, in my opinion, after Mitt Romney loses the election in 2012. Donald Trump embraced Mitt Romney, endorsed Mitt Romney. Other Republicans didn't like Mitt Romney because, again, it's geographical. It's geographic. He was from a liberal state. He was from Massachusetts, the most liberal state in the Union, or has always been the most liberal state in the Union, going back to the Civil War, right? they didn't like Romney for that. The evangelicals didn't like Romney because he had a different religion. He was Mormon, and most of them are evangelical Protestants, and they consider Mormonism a cult. Now there's some truth to it because Mormonism, the beliefs are a little bit crazy. You know what I mean? But whatever, his religion is his religion, whatever, right? So they didn't like him for that. So after he loses, then MAGA comes about. Yeah, that's when it got a name. But there was a movement already of conservatives, particularly Andrew Breitbart. Andrew Breitbart ran an online website. This man named Andrew Breitbart, who was assassinated. He was also shot, and he was one of those who was preaching against the Republican establishment. Ben Shapiro got his start at Breitbart. Yeah, he was Breitbart was Andrew Breitbart was assassinated in 2012. Uh, but he was basically the brain, the modern day conservative movement, the modern day MAGA movement was basically his brainchild before Donald Trump jumped on it. Donald Trump just became the mouthpiece for it, but these ideas were already fermenting. These ideas were already fermenting um, in the movement already. You know what I'm saying? They were talking against the Republican establishment because what the Republican establishment was imagining after Romney lost the election, because you remember that night, Lisa. I posted about it on Facebook. I don't know if you remember this. The difference maker for Obama in the 2012 election was the Latino vote. The Latino vote. So Republicans said, you know what we got to do? The mainstream Republicans, the establishment Republicans, they said, we got to go back to the drawing board because we lost so badly in this election. Like Obama, they thought Obama was going to be Jimmy Carter. They thought he was going to be a one-term president and they were going to beat him. So what we got to do is we got to make the Republican Party less white, and we got to appeal to Latino voters, and we got to soften our stance on immigration. But the Breitbart faction, they were like, no, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to go more racist. We're going to go more anti-immigrant. We're going to go more xenophobic, and we're going to, appeal to a far-right demographic. So Breitbart started to formulate these ideas. And Milo Yiannopoulos comes out of that as a conservative thinker. Ben Shapiro comes out of Breitbart's website as a conservative thinker. These were the new Republicans. These were the beginnings of MAGA, the early stages of MAGA before Donald Trump even jumped on it and gave it a name. So you're right, Lisa, in the sense that he gave it the name, but these ideas of a far-right Republicanism, a repudiation of George Bush, a repudiation of both the Bushes, a repudiation of the Republican establishment was born in 2012 in the ashes of Mitt Romney's loss. You had essentially a civil war within the Republican Party, and Donald Trump's faction of that Republican Party, that Breitbart faction, won out. They won the civil war, and they control the realm. So in a sense, yes. In a sense, no. And you had a similar civil war. You had a similar civil war in the Democratic Party. Within the Democratic Party, after the loss of Hillary Clinton in 2016, the Democrats were like, well, what's going on, right? Why did we lose so badly? Like we thought, just like with the Republicans in 2012, we thought we had this in the bag. Like How did we lose? So then you had the establishment Democrats, like the Hillary Clintons, like the Barack Obamas, like those people. And then you had the Bernie Sanders faction of of the Democratic Party, the AOCs of the Democratic Party, the younger people of the Democratic Party, more ethnically diverse, less educated, more appealing to the LGBTQ section of the party. And that section of the party has not really, in the Democratic Party, has not really won out yet. The civil war in the Democratic Party is still going on as we speak because the Democratic establishment, they didn't listen. They didn't listen. They weren't like the Republican establishment. Republican establishment stepped aside. Romneys, the McCains, they stepped aside to accommodate the Trump side of the Republican Party. The Democratic side, the old Democrats didn't step aside. The Nancy Pelosi's, the Harry Reids, the Obamas, the Clintons, they didn't step aside for that. You know what I'm saying? They didn't accommodate the new. The war is still going on. Between the Bernie Sanders faction and the Biden, Obama, Clinton faction of the Democratic Party. It's still going on to this day. And they didn't listen in 2024. They nominated Kamala Harris, who she wasn't what the people wanted, of the Democratic, the younger Democrats. She represented old hat, you know what I mean? And they paid the price. You know what I mean? Now I think though in 2028, I think though Lise, they're listening and they're going to go with somebody further to the left of Kamala and Hillary in AOC maybe. But the problem is when it comes to Democrats though, is that the radical wing of the party is represented in a few key states: New York, California, mostly on the West Coast. Whereas they want to win the entire election for the country, and the country is rather moderate, and kind of Republican leaning. So they want to get somebody. The DNC wants to get somebody more attractive in that sense. More mainstream, like a Gavin Newsom. But I'll tell you this. If Gavin Newsom runs as the Democratic candidate in 2028 against, let's say, J.D. Vance, right, he will lose because Gavin Newsom will not get the support of the Democrats, of the younger Democrats. He doesn't. He's more establishment. And that's not what people want. People want something different. People want something new in the Democratic Party. And they haven't seen it since Barack Obama. And, Barack Obama was a great president, in a sense, but he let a lot of people down in terms of progressives, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. He did not do what they wanted him to do. What they imagined that he would do. Now, he was blocked a lot by Republicans in Congress, but for the first 2 years, he had control of the House and the Senate, and he didn't act on it. You know what I mean? So, he took the shellacking he took in the 2010 election because, and he even said it, we took a shellacking, those were his words, because he didn't pull out completely of Iraq, which was one of his campaign promises, and he didn't close Gitmo. That was two of the biggest things that that progressive Democrats were looking for in a president, and he didn't do it. Uh, Obama is liberal. Obama's a liberal Democrat, obviously, but Obama is very cautious. He was very cautious when he ran for president. When he was president, in the stuff that he did. The Republicans are funny to conservatives because they made him out to be this radical, this Marxist, this leftist, this uh, this Marxist Leninist. That he was palling around with Bill Ayers of the Weatherman Underground, a terrorist organization, or that he was a radical Muslim. He wasn't any of that shit. Obama was basically to the left of Bill Clinton, kind of like Bill Clinton, a kind of middle of the road guy. He wasn't any of that shit, that shit like they were talking about. They were just upset because the black guy won. What I mean? Like, if anything, Obama took as much criticism from the progressive left wing side of the party that was also just like with Breitbart and eventually the Daily Wire and shit like this. The Democratic side of the party was getting a huge voice online. They were getting the Young Turks and Jimmy Dore and these show, and eventually like a Hassan Piker, right? Those guys were becoming popular on the political left as speakers, and they were those channels, and David Pakman too. Those channels were speaking up just as much against Barack Obama as they were against the Republicans because they felt like Obama wasn't doing enough at that time. I remember watching the Young Turks, especially the Young Turks. Like, I don't think David Pakman existed at that time. I'm not sure. I wasn't following him back then, but the Young Turks I was following. Anna Kasparian and Cenk Uygur, and they were definitely giving it to Obama. They were definitely, calling him out right and left when it came to that. You know what I mean? So the Democratic version of Trump, of the progressive, what came out of the Occupy movement. Because don't forget, Lisa, the Occupy movement started in 2011 and really became popular in 2012. Bernie Sanders was a direct result of the Occupy movement. You know what I mean? And that was the Democrat answer to Donald Trump. He was the Democratic anti-establishment guy, and Trump was the Republican anti-establishment guy. But the DNC screwed him over. The DNC cheated him out of the nomination. So the DNC paid the price. you know. Now, we'll never know if Bernie Sanders could have defeated Donald Trump. If the populism of Bernie Sanders, both guys engaged in populism. Bernie Sanders in left-wing populism and Donald Trump in right-wing populism. Both guys, the Republican side tried to do it to Donald Trump because really the Republican establishment guys, they wanted either Jeb Bush or Ted Cruz. They wanted those two guys. You know what I mean? And the Democratic establishment wanted Hillary Clinton because they felt like Hillary stepped aside for Obama, right, in 2008. And she, and it was finally her turn. So both sides had their guys, their people picked out. But the RNC couldn't figure out a way to fuck Donald Trump in the same way that the DNC fucked Bernie. you know what I mean? So they ended up with their guy, and their movement, their party and their movement changed, and our party and our movement stayed the same. Oh, the new one, yeah. The new one, yeah. Our party and our movement stayed the same. Lee Sachs was going to get Our party and our movement stayed the same because the leaders in our movement, the leaders in our party, decided that our voices didn't matter. So many people voted for Jill Stein, right, in the Green Party, which, yeah, I am, Lisa, which was a the Green Party is a further left party to the Democrats, like the further right party to the Republicans. It's a Libertarian Party, right? There's really four parties in this country, but they only focus on two. There's really four because the Green and Libertarian never win elections. you know what I mean? So, and you know, I won't be able to watch it, but I'll probably DVR it or watch clips of it at least. But that'd be interesting. I remember it because I was in support of Bernie. I supported Bernie in 2016, and everybody came out. All the people that supported Hillary Clinton came out and said, "Oh, the Bernie Bros. They're all sexist. You know, they don't they don't like Hillary Clinton because she's a woman." You know, and the Bernie Bros. Remember that the Bernie Bros. Yeah, they're all sexist. They don't want to see. Well, you know what? Maybe if we went with Bernie, we would have won the election, and Donald Trump wouldn't even. We wouldn't be talking about Donald Trump in this present tense. Because people by 2016 will go down in history as one of the most interesting years in American history, American political history, because both sides wanted something different. The Republicans were offering up another Bush, and the Democrats were offering up another Clinton. You know what I mean? Like, this is what the establishments wanted because they were used to Bush, they were used to Clinton. So, like, okay, we'll take another Bush, another Clinton. And that's when Jesse Ventura, again, going back to him, he's always been outspoken. He's a guy, he's been outspoken in politics, he's been outspoken in wrestling, he's always been outspoken. He said, he wrote that book in 2016, The Democrats and the Republicans. In other words, saying that the Democrats and the Republicans, they're like gangs. You know what I mean? Like mafia families, the way they operate. And that it was becoming like oligarchies of the Clinton family and the Bush family. You know what I mean? Like trying to take over and shit. But we had these two different kinds of candidates, that both appealing to the common people, both appealing to the everyday average individual. One on the Republican side, Donald Trump, and the other on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders. Both saying things that were unorthodox in political conversations, that weren't really heard, and they were both on fire. And the DNC stopped Bernie, and the RNC was unable to stop Donald Trump, and eventually Trump's followers took over the RNC. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, Lise, of do I think MAGA and Republicans are different? Maybe at one time, maybe the side of the Republican Party that he's talking about, George Bush, is the side, but that side no longer exists. That side is dead. You know what I'm saying? That's like saying, well, what about the Lincoln Republicans? You know what I mean? Like, yeah, Lincoln was a Republican, but he was a different kind of Republican. The parties have changed over time, since their inception. The Republicans in the 1850s and the Democrats in the 1820s. The Democrats come about as a part, because there was an election in 1828, um, between uh, Andrew Jackson and another president's son, John Quincy Adams, and they were part of the Democratic Republicans because initially there was no political parties, but then after the revolution there was two. There was the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists founded by Alexander Hamilton and the Democratic Republicans founded by Thomas Jefferson. But there was a period in American history called the Era of Good Feelings after the War of 1812, where the political beef stopped. But after the election, after the in the 1820s between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy, they split, and Jackson's followers became Democrats, and the followers of John Quincy Adams became Whigs, which eventually became Republicans. That's just why the animal that represents the Democrats is a donkey, because Jackson, a jackass, his opponents called him a jackass. you know, you know, you know, that's why the animal. But Andrew Jackson is the founder of the Democratic Party. But that Democratic Party is different than the Democratic Party that exists today. um, and Andrew Jackson is Trump's favorite president. He is a lot like Andrew Jackson in a lot of ways. Andrew Jackson was uh, he was supposed to be the president of the common man because he didn't come from an aristocratic background like the presidents before him, and he ran the election in the 1820s, the first one between himself and John Quincy Adams against a president's son from a very liberal state of Massachusetts. Again, there's that Massachusetts thing versus Jackson, who was a Southerner. There's that Massachusetts, North versus South thing, even before the Civil War. But anyway, he was for the common man. He was for the everyday average and Joe. He was Irish. He was of Irish descent. First president of Irish descent, which is a big thing because Irish, we come from English. Well, we don't. But you and I don't, Lisa. But America's heritage is English heritage, and English and not the Irish have always been historical enemies. So that was a big thing that Jackson was of Irish descent. But and he was a hero of the War of 1812 and the Battle of New Orleans, which was a definitive battle in 1815 during the War of 1812. So he was he represented the common man. But one of the things about him was that he was a slave owner and that he was racist. He orchestrated the Indian Removal Act of the 1830s while he was president, removing the five confederized what they call the five civilized tribes, particularly the Cherokee Nation in Georgia to west out to Oklahoma. This is what is called the Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson is responsible for that. And of course, he was a slave owner, like I said. But he was a lot like Trump. He would fight against his opponents. And the opponents in the papers would say that he was a king. He was like a king, right? King Andrew, they would call him. Because he would call his enemy, he would call his people that he disagreed with. He wouldn't just disagree with them civilly. He would call them, his enemies and shit. You know what I mean? So he was a lot like Trump in a way. So yeah. Uh, but he would not have. I don't think Andrew Jackson would have been in support of a civil war, though. Even though he was a proud Southerner and a slave owner, when North Carolina tried to secede from the Union the first time in the 1830s, which was called the nullification crisis, he was against it and he prevented it from happening. Um, do I think once Trump leaves office, things will go back? No, it will never be the same. The party is fundamentally changed. I don't think we'll ever get back to the way things were. You know what I mean? You can't undo it because it's bigger than Trump. Like I said, the movement existed before Trump. You know what I mean? What this basically was a backlash against Obama's presidency. It was the poor whites, you know, feeling that they lost their country, feeling that the world around them is changing. LGBT marriage is becoming a thing. Um, Minorities are more represented. And that was their backlash. Trump just became the face of it. He just the figurehead of it. He didn't. It's like saying, was Hulk Hogan responsible for the boom in the 1980s of professional wrestling? Not directly, but he was the guy chosen by Vince McMahon to do it. So Trump was the chosen face of this contingency of the Democratic Party. I mean, the Republican Party. You know what I mean? This outrage against social change, against LGBT inclusion, against multiculturalism. And we're seeing it not just in America, at least, but in Europe. Recently in England, they had a march of ultra conservatives led by a gentleman named Tommy Robinson against immigration there, particularly from the Muslim world. So we're seeing it in various countries in which people in the Western world, European world, are starting to feel like their they're losing their grip on society because for centuries now, since basically 1492, since Spain commissioned Christopher Columbus to come to, well, a voyage to India, but he ended up coming to America. The European countries have been the top countries of the world, right? Spain, France, America, England, these European Western countries that are part of Western/white civilization. And that's changing now. You know what I mean? China is dominant. Um, Africa is on the come up. Latin America is on the come up. India is on the come up. These nations were in the 20th century, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, in the early part of the 21st century, they were underneath the boot, either severely underdeveloped or underneath the boot of Western colonialism. Now they're rising up, and it, it's it's uncomfortable for a lot of white people, both in America and in other countries, to accept the fact that other races of people are now becoming ascendant, because never in their lifetime have they ever experienced that. The last time that was a thing when Europe was in the Dark Ages and Islam and the Islamic civilization and China were the top civilizations. That was in like the 11th century, the 12th century, the 13th century, the Middle Ages. You know what I mean? Nobody remembers that far back. You know, they're not used to that. That's uncomfortable for a lot of Caucasians, white folks, and they feel like they're losing it, and they're reacting very violently. They don't know how to deal with it because they've never experienced it. And it happens in all kinds of civilizations. It happens to the Muslims. For the longest, the Muslims were the top civilization from the time that Islam was founded in, not founded necessarily in 610, but the end of Muhammad's life in 632 to about the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Like when the Ottoman Empire started to wane in Turkey, Muslims were a global power. And then when Muslims got overtaken by Europeans, they didn't know how to react to it because they never experienced that. They experienced a world where Islam was supreme. you know, and out of that came the Islamic restorationist movements like ISIS and like Al Qaeda, and like the Iranian Revolution, to where they felt like, okay, we lost our way. We became too liberalized. We became too westernized. Now we got to get back to basics. We got to get back to what made us a great civilization. So white people are doing that too. White people are saying, well, where did we go wrong? Why are we losing? What can we do to make it better? And they're turning inward and they're becoming more racist and xenophobic, just like the Muslims became more extreme when they were faced with opposition from the West. It's happened to all civilizations. It happened to the Chinese. The Chinese, the Opium Wars of the late 19th century, the 1890s. They experienced England invading them. They experienced, half of their population on drugs because of drugs that the British imported into China. And they didn't know how to deal with finally, being under somebody else's control. And their answer to that was to become more traditional. Now, the only nation that reacted differently to that was Japan. Japan was faced with that too, but what Japan decided to do was they said, we'll take the best of the knowledge and the culture of the Europeans, and we'll modernize and we'll westernize. We'll abandon Shintoism, we'll abandon the samurai code, Bushido, and we'll become more westernized. And that's what's called the Meiji Restoration. And that's why Japan was technically never conquered by any European power and wasn't really overtaken by any Western power necessarily until America comes in at the end of World War II in the 40s. Japan itself was the conqueror. Japan was the one who had the empire. Japan was the one challenging Western supremacy in Asia, white supremacy in Asia, and was supposed to be the representative for the Asian man, the liberator of the Asian man, particularly in places where Europeans were ruling, like Indochina or India. For Hindus, for Indian people, they've experienced, their civilization has been denigrated for centuries. They experienced conquest at the hands of the Muslims and conquest at the hands of white people. So, I don't see it going back, Lisa. I don't. It's just a reaction to modernization, just like in the Muslim world. Anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see my next video is coming out.